Hello and welcome back to I Say Are Wrong. Today we're going to be talking about how much Doctor Who is there out there and how much am I going to be covering in my quest to watch, listen or read everything that exists. So here we go. Doctor Who recently celebrated its 60th anniversary with 3 specials, which kind of focused on the past, celebrating old foes, old friends, etc. Over the 60 years that the programme has been running, it's aired round about 875 episodes, which covers 300-ish stories. However, that is just kind of only scratching the surface. We also have things such as the novels and the comics that were released alongside airing series, and the audio CDs released by things like Big Finish and BBC Audio of previous Doctors. And that is not even coming to terms with other things such as spin-offs like the Sarah Jane Adventures and Torchwood, which on their own have their own comics, audios and novels. So how big is the Doctor Who universe and where does it end? So in order to investigate that, we really need to look at one contentious topic within the Doctor Who community, and that is canon. Chapter 1. What is canon? What is canon? Well, originally the word came from a collection of books which made up the legally recognised Bible, and right from the start, what is and what is not considered canon in regard to the Bible was awash with controversy in itself, as the word was applied to many other collections and it kind of piled on top of each other. Generally today, we use it in 2 different ways. The first kind of being a group of works which is attributed to a person. For example, canonical works of Sherlock Holmes would be the ones that were written by Arthur Conan Doyle, or even expanding into other areas, including like the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. In fact, the first use of the word meaning like a collection of things was in reference to the works of Arthur Conan Doyle, which helped to differentiate his works with the huge amount of works published featuring Holmes by other authors. The first way is a good way of sectioning what is part of a group and what is not for study, and the second, and the type that we're going to talk about today, is used to determine what actually happened within a fictional universe. The key for this type of canon was establishing the continuity and a thorough line throughout franchises, helping build worlds and callbacks in many different series since. Almost every series, I think, has a different way it deals with canon and continuity. When series have a single definitive creator, the bounds of canon seem to be a lot stricter, for example. So if we look at something which kind of follows that path, like Star Wars was created by George Lucas and the original trilogy of films was released in the 70s. Since then, there have been heaps of other films, television series, comics and novels similar to that of Doctor Who, but they're a far more cut and dry approach to canon than a lot of other series. Famously, Lucas set the original films, the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars as the strict canon, with everything else having to fall into line with those things when he was talking about it. Despite that, there are a number of different comics that are overridden by novels which are overridden by television series, and television series which have inconsistencies among themselves. Regardless, within Star Wars, the main canon is those original pieces of media and everything falls into line with that. Lucas always made it clear that he was not beholden to the EU. He set the films he created as the canon. This includes the 6 Star Wars episodes, the many hours of content he developed and produced in Star Wars: The Clone Wars, and these stories are the immovable objects of Star Wars history, the characters and events to which all other tales must align. So knowing this, let's compare it to a similar franchise but slightly different, Star Trek. Although Star Trek was created by one man, Gene Roddenberry, it became a franchise of television shows instead of films, built upon by an array of different writers. Due to that, the canon is more complicated and expansive, and in essence, there is far more restrictions on things like continuity, world building, and the universe of Star Trek than in Star Wars. The way that the canon of Star Trek was viewed has changed with each new iteration, although largely what was considered is pretty similar across it. Although Roddenberry had a large amount of control creatively over the first few seasons of the original series, he didn't believe in the strict creator-controlled canon like Lucas did, and he even stated himself, I would hope there are bright young people growing up all the time who will bring to Star Trek levels and areas that were beyond me. And I don't feel jealous about that at all. It'll go on without any of us and get better and better and better, because that is really the human condition. It's to improve and to improve. The official Star Trek website has a list of things that is considered the official canon, which includes all of 12 live action series, as well as the original films and the 2 animated series. Anything else is considered non-canonical by this standard. This includes licensed work that was published since the original series. The novels were earlier decided by Gene Roddenberry to not have any effect on the television series, although some of the non-fiction books are considered canonical towards the larger universe as well. And likewise, the comics and magazines are also not considered canonical. In relation to the 2009 film, this is also said to be in a different universe, so their canon is different from the rest of the series. Now, with each of these 2 levels of canon, let's come back to our point in the first place, Doctor Who. If these 3 pieces of media were on a spectrum for how close to canon or how important canon is, Star Wars would probably be here, Star Trek would be here, and right on the very other side of the page would be Doctor Who. The main difference in this case is the nature of how Doctor Who was created. From the very beginning, Doctor Who was a collaboration of different people at the BBC, taking inspiration from many different areas. The closest it has to a creator is Sidney Newman, who was the head of the BBC drama department at the time, Cecil Edwin Webber, the staff writer for the BBC, Donald Wilson, head of serials at the BBC, and they came up with the original idea, and the producer Verity Lambert carried that through production. This was not uncommon for the BBC at the time, with the way television was produced in different countries contributing to the differences in how important these things were, for example, comparing Star Trek and Doctor Who. There was no one keeping a keen eye on the continuity and the world building in the same way that can be seen in Star Trek and Star Wars, and even in the first few years alone, there were multiple inconsistencies, not only with the world building, but with the characters themselves. The act of building upon the Doctor resulted in the character we know now. His species of people were not mentioned until the end of season 6. The fact that he has 2 hearts wasn't even mentioned until season 7, and both of these were written by people who had very little to do with the original production. The design of having a different director and writer for each serial created a group effort. As the years passed, and the producer of each season made their impact known, the show became more prominent in its eras, although the group approach persisted. This lack of consistent creator, like Lucas or Roddenberry, contributed to this sort of Frankenstein of a series, carrying through the bits that worked and leaving the bits that didn't. Even to this day, things that are being changed and added to, such as Chibnall's The Timeless Child, which has the possibility of enveloping lesser known media which has always been ignored, although not in any way declared non-canonical. Now, this strange liminal effect that canon has in Doctor Who is best explained by Paul Cornell, Doctor Who novel and TV writer since the 90s, in his blog post from 2007. Nobody at the BBC has ever uttered a pronouncement about what is and isn't canonical, as I'm sure they'd put it, being such enthusiasts for good grammar, because there was never a Who product that the BBC made that got a producer's goat enough for that to happen. This is, in essence, what makes Doctor Who unique. Although the show has been created by a group of people, it's the BBC which really has the power over what was published. But then again, there's another loophole. The BBC does not control the Doctor Who universe either. They hold the trademark for a particular few concepts, like the Doctor, the TARDIS, and the Time Lords. Yet, the vast majority of other crucial parts are actually owned by the writers that originally came up with them. This is seen probably most starkly through the writer Terry Nation, the creator of the Daleks. Terry Nation wrote the second ever serial, The Daleks, in 1963, which instantly became a success. He also wrote The Dalek Invasion of Earth, which expanded the countrywide Dalek mania, which led to the production of 2 separate films featuring Peter Cushing. Due to the way that the BBC dealt with copyrights at the time, Nation actually owned the Daleks and used the 12-part serial The Daleks Master Plan to try and launch an American TV series called The Destroyers. The first ever Dr. Light story, The Mission to the Unknown, set up the Space Security Service, and the Destroyers was to follow their battle against the Daleks. However, both the BBC and the ABC rejected the programme, and for a short while, Nation had signed an agreement for the BBC to relinquish its rights to the Daleks. This led to the Daleks being removed from the programme for a while, with their last major appearance being The Evil of the Daleks in 1967. However, this wasn't the end for Nation's Daleks. The characters from the spin-off that he intended appeared in Dalek-focused books and comics, effectively creating Doctor Who's first spin-off through this medium. The early script for The Destroyers was recorded in 2010, with Jean Marsh reviving her role as Sarah Kingdom. The Daleks eventually returned to the main show in The Day of the Daleks in 1972, 5 years after their last appearance. So this in itself raises a quite interesting point about Doctor Who copyright. The BBC and the showrunners of the show do not control the wider Doctor Who universe. They control the character of the Doctor. Each writer, with it be Nation with the Daleks, Cornell for Bernie Summerfield, and Marks for Iris Wildthyme, control their own small corner and create as much as they want within the universe. There is no, and there has never been, one official source of Doctor Who content. But there is one thing that Doctor Who also has that means that it's unique, and that's being created by the BBC. Doctor Who is, in essence, a creation of a public service. The BBC has a policy that even though they publish novels, audios, comics and games, the television show has to make sense without any of them. The story that aired on BBC One has to be understood without any prior knowledge of anything that is sold. Purchasing other things should not be required. If you had to buy a BBC product to understand a BBC show, it breaks the BBC Charter and guidelines. That means that the growth of the Doctor Who universe never actually stops. Ever since the first episode aired in 1963, there has been constant production and releases over the last 60 years in one form or the other, including in the wilderness years where it was not on television. Doctor Who, therefore, can never really be finished or complete, and an official canon cannot really be created. So, what's the solution? How do we kind of describe what was in the Doctor Who universe? Well, although that might be something that creates debate for many hours and there isn't really a right answer to it, the closest you can get to is whatever you want. Creating a way that you interact with the Doctor Who universe is probably the best approach to these things, choosing what you like and discarding what you don't. Everything is canon, but nothing is canon. That doesn't mean we lose the lovely thought that Doctor Who is all one big story. It's one big and very complex story that rewrites and contradicts itself. That is always the case, and only now it does it with purpose rather than accident. Don't you think, for instance, there's something rather tragic and romantic about the Doctor, living through some of the same events in different ways, having lost chunks of his own past? With that being said, that was an awful long introduction to bring you to the point of the video. I attempted to catalogue every single thing in the Doctor Who universe, and it sort of drove me insane. Chapter 2. What's included in the universe and where do we stop? So what this taught me, first and foremost, is there's far too many things out there in the Doctor Who universe. So much that it's actually very difficult to keep track of everything. I used a number of different sources to kind of keep my timelines in check. However, most of these disappeared when I moved on from stories featuring the Doctor and trying to look at spin-offs only. The main sources that I used were the TARDIS Wiki, the Discontinuity Guide, the Doctor Who Reference Guide, the audio timeline compiled to the Big Finish Listeners Facebook group, and the Cloister Library. These helped me kind of devise a main timeline as well as the main streams for spin-offs. Then, after that, pretty much every source dries up. The only one that is helpful past this point is the TARDIS Wiki, and even that is extremely scattered and only reliable about half the time. So, in order to get the actual stories for things like anthologies and novels, I had to go directly to the source for most of them through publisher websites, social media announcements, or through word of mouth like Discord, Reddit, or Tumblr. So I'm working on the assumption that I have definitely missed some stories out here, but bearing in mind this document is going to be a work in progress as I go, so hopefully I'll be able to fill in any gaps of anything that I'm missing as I listen to them all. So to start with, I sorted all of the stories into 6 distinct groups. So first off, probably the most important, the TV series. So TV is how I classified it, and that includes the TV series, any films, webcasts, small stories like minisodes. These can either be live action or animated, for example, the 2 animated serials featuring the 10th Doctor. The core of the timeline when it comes to the Doctor is based around their appearances in either Classic Who or New Who, so the order that they were aired are the order that we keep it in our timelines. The second one is audio, which is perhaps the second biggest medium for Doctor Who, much in thanks to companies like Big Finish Productions and BBV Audio. Over their 2.5 decades of producing audio stories, many of which have the original actors reprising their roles and expanding their timeline, Big Finish in particular have bulked out the timelines of many of the later Classic Doctors. Big Finish in particular have bulked out the timelines of many of the later Doctors in Classic Who, especially added a significant amount of stories to the 8th Doctor's run. However, they're not the only ones that have been producing audio adventures. The first ever audio was released in 1981 by Argo Records, and this tradition has continued ever since. There are a couple of different types of things included in this category, but they have some specific rules associated with them. So first off, any audio which is unique to the medium is counted. For example, the lost episodes still persevere through the use of enhanced original audio with narration. These do not count as audio, but rather I've included them in the TV section just for simplicity's sake. Any novel or short story anthology which has an audiobook reading is not counted in audio, it's counted in short stories or novels. And only audiobooks which have never been released in print are included here, for example, like the audio novels from Big Finish. So, bringing that on to the next one, let's look at novels. So, I've split the short stories and novels into 2 different categories for 2 reasons. The first is length. So novels or novellas tend to be a bit longer than short stories that are published in anthologies, and the type of story that they tend to tell is different. They have more depth and more world building. The second is that there are a hell of a lot of short stories, and I wanted to keep them separate just for numbers reason. The novellas or novels have been a mainstay of Doctor Who from the very start when it was released, with the first of them coming out in 1964. During the Wilderness era, it was the novel ranges that kept fans invested, introducing significant characters like Bernie Summerfield and Fritz Krainer, the former being the character which helped launch Big Finish. Then, once the show came back, the novels were a regular mainstay of the BBC publishing, carrying on adventures from the screen with contemporary companions and doctors. And our fourth one would be short stories. So, although novels perhaps outnumber them in the amount of physical books published, the anthologies have something that no other medium of Doctor Who possesses, and that is the most stories. Each short story that was included had to be its own unique adventure, and that was pretty much the only stipulation to enter this category. Normally, anthologies focus on more than one Doctor, with all 27 of the Big Finish anthologies, yes, they published books too, having a story with each of the Doctors from 1 to 8, with most of these books having published at least 10 short stories each. The BBC also published a number of different anthologies in the same style, for example, the Target Storybook and Tales of Terror. But anthologies are not the only place where short stories are found or are even common. The Doctor Who magazine started in 1979 and frequently had short stories included in them. They also came from numerous different annuals that were published, such as the Dalek Annual, the K9 Annual, and of course the Doctor Who annuals, right from the very start of the mid-60s. All of these contribute to a category which is very, very large, but very scattered and hard to keep track of. And our second last category are comics. Similar to the short stories, the comics featuring the Doctor have been a mainstay of the Doctor Who magazine since its launch, with every issue normally having at least 1 or 2 comics inside. Not only this, but numerous different comic ranges have been published independently since the 80s, and during Tennant and Smith's run, there were 3 different comic ranges ongoing at the same time. That included IDW Publishing, Battles in Time, and the Doctor Who Adventures. Therefore, it is not surprising that comics have actually made up a large chunk of the newer Doctor's timeline, with some, for example, 10, 11, and 4, having comic-only companions. The comics have also existed in annuals as well, with the earliest comic coming from 1964 and being published in the TV comic range, which was a sci-fi range at the time. So my final category for kind of talking about Doctor Who was other, and these are separated in my spreadsheet into their own categories, but they're very, very small, so I tend to lump them together here. These are stories which take place in a starkly different medium to the others, like games, plays, or poems. There have been a number of different stage plays, most of which been adapted by Big Finish into audios, including The Seven Keys of Doomsday, which was designed to be a third Doctor before he transitioned to the fourth Doctor. So for that one, I placed it in the third Doctor's timeline. Even though he was portrayed by the sixth Doctor in the adaptation, Colin Baker played him on stage. Even though he was portrayed by the sixth Doctor in the audio adaptation, Colin Baker played him through Big Finish. Doctor Who has a number of different video games associated with it too. They started in 1983 with the BBC Micros game The First Adventure, featuring the Fifth Doctor as a sort of Pac-Man-like creature. The BBC have consistently made Doctor Who games since, whether that includes standalone releases like consoles like Wii or Flash games played directly on the BBC website. However, one of the most expansive Doctor Who games that have been published has to be the role-playing game, which was first devised in 1985 and has been constantly added to and upgraded until the most recent release in 2022. This is similar to like D&D and really took off in popularity around the same time. Lastly, there are only 2 Doctor Who books of poetry published, and I liked them, so I wanted to talk about them, so they're being included in my timeline, even though they're not really adventures. They do have a distinct storyline through each of the poems, so that's why I included them. With this 6 base categories, the timelines could be constructed from here on in. However, with a lot of Doctor Who, there are a lot of repeat adaptations or recreations of the same story. These would include things from the novelisations to the novel adaptations range in Big Finish. The original story for each of these are included in the timeline, but the direct adaptations are added to their own sections separate from the main timeline, unless there are significant changes to the story that would essentially allow it to be added as a separate story. An example of one that would not be included would be Love and War, the novel adaptation from Big Finish, which came from the novel of the same name. One that would be included, however, would be Human Nature, the TV adaptation of the novel Human Nature, also from the Virgin New Adventures range. So, with that in mind, let's get into some statistics. Chapter 3, The Doctor. So I started with the first Doctor, and eventually decided the timeline would start with the Doctor and Susan leaving Gallifrey. It was the most distinct event that I could really place the beginning at, due to the many different extra things that have been added and complicated throughout the 60 years that Doctor Who's been running. Everything pre this are included in other Doctors' eras, including Extra Doctors and the Fugitive Doctors era. With that being said, there are numerous different stories which depict the event of the Doctor and Susan leaving Gallifrey, which no clear indication of which comes first. So it was basically arbitrary on what I chose to go first. So with that, I chose the beginning, which is the companion chronicle from Big Finish, to start things off. And from there on in, we are following the journey of the Doctor all the way up to the newest story, which, as time of recording, it was the Church on Ruby Road featuring Ncuti Gatwa. Bear in mind, though, this will have been accurate up until February 2024, which is the end of which when I'm recording, although I will be continuously updating it, so the video statistics are going to be updated to that point, and then if you want to have a look at it, I'm going to leave a spreadsheet in the description which shows all the stories. In total, there are 4,638 stories featuring the Doctor. Before we break these down into stories per Doctor, let's break it down into the type of medium that it is in. TV, where Doctor Who originates from, accounts for just over 10% of the total stories, with 485 of them being over the last 60 years. Bear in mind, this is not an episode count, but a story count. So we're counting serials as one, and we're also counting like two-parters as one. The medium with the highest amount of stories in it is audio. Audio has a whopping 1,275 stories, which includes audio-only books and short stories, as well as all of the audio plays produced by numerous different companies. The second highest comes in at 1,265 stories, and that is comic strips or stories. Third, and the only other category to have over 1,000 stories in it, is short stories. The only other major category left is novels, which has 431 stories, and the extras include 5 plays, 29 poems, and 73 games. So now that overall breakdown has been done, let's go over per Doctor. So I think I'm going to include this graph that I spent a ridiculous amount of time doing, so I hope you like it. First up is the First Doctor, with 282 stories, most of which were audio. None of the audio stories feature any voice work by William Hartnell, however, due to the first being released after his death. William Russell, Carol Ann Ford, David Bradley and Stephen Noonan, plus some others, have all voiced his part for him. The Second Doctor came in with a slightly lower total of 255, with 36 of these stories taking place in Season 6B, which is a term people use for the time when, or if, the Second Doctor worked for the Time Lords before being exiled on Earth. His largest medium was short stories. The Third Doctor is where we have a slight jump up again, totaling 289, just 7 more than the First Doctor. His largest medium was short stories as well, with 103 coming from the very popular annuals of the early 70s. A lot of the stories from this era heavily lean into the unit dating controversy. So while they're easy to place in the Doctor's timeline, it's a lot harder for everyone else. Unsurprising, probably nobody, the longest running Doctor of Classic Who comes in at a huge 507 stories. The majority of his run is made up of audios, as the BBC started releasing audios with Tom Baker in the 80s, and close to second is short stories, however, with only 5 stories between them. Next up is the Fifth Doctor with 303 stories, over half of which are audio, with Peter Davison reprising his role through Big Finish. Peter Davison, Colin Baker and Sylvester McCoy kicked off the main range for Big Finish in 1999, reprising their roles as 5, 6 and 7 respectively. Colin Baker's Doctor, the Sixth Doctor, has 358 separate stories, with 177 of them being audio. 6 was unique in the main range, as he was the first to get his own companion in the form of historian Professor Evelyn Smythe. This was followed up by a number of new companions that helped extend his run. With the Seventh Doctor came the end of the original run of Doctor Who in 1989. However, 7 lived on in the first half of the Wilderness era and had his own book series, The Virgin New Adventures. He has 426 stories, most of which are audio, but like the Fourth Doctor, his short stories are close behind. In 1996, the Eighth Doctor had one of only 3 TV appearances in the TV movie. That does not stop him from having an extremely high amount of stories though, with 421, 214 of them being audio. It has perhaps the most original EU companions, with at least 20 having multiple stories alongside him. So, this was the end of Classic Who and the Wilderness era, with the top 3 Doctors in terms of stories being 4, 7 and 8. But New Who was just around the bend, and things are about to change. Although the War Doctor would have technically been in here next, he only has 43 stories, most of which, round about 30, are audio, over 2 main ranges, the War Doctor and the War Doctor Begins. So on we skipped to 9, and we have the shortest running Doctor with only 1 series. However, he has around 119 stories, with a good mix of all mediums, mainly due to comic book ranges, novel ranges, and short story ranges beginning with New Who in 2005. And similar to the Fourth Doctor, we have perhaps the most popular Doctor of the new era, and that is the 10th Doctor. And that should not surprise anyone that he usurps the current leader for top spot, having whopping 587 stories. His most popular medium might surprise people though. In total, he has 313 separate comic stories, most of which were released during the 5-year period in which he was the Doctor. The comic ranges being extremely popular carried over to the 11th Doctor's time, with 325 out of his 577 stories being comics as well. The sheer amount of comic ranges that were running simultaneously during these years were cut back towards the end of Smith's television run, which leads us straight into the 12th Doctor's timeline, and he has a total of 284 stories, again the highest being comics, which is 118. He had a number of mini-stoods that stood separate from his TV run as well, bulking out a lot of the visual medium stories that he had during his tenure. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a drop when we come to the next Doctor, with 13 only having 136 stories despite having 3 series. Her highest medium was surprisingly TV, for the first time in our list, mainly due to the extra shorts and minisodes she produced through the COVID-19 pandemic. Naturally, the next 2 Doctors don't have a lot of stories, mainly because they've only been about for the last few months. The 14th Doctor has 12 stories, and the 15th has 3. So now we've looked over our main timeline, let's check out some of the other Doctors. So the Fugitive Doctor only has about 3 stories, although there are more releasing later next year, and the Valeyard has only 1 standalone story. The Meta-Crisis Doctor has 4 stories, and other Doctors in this category such as the Unbound, Fatal Death Doctor, Doctor Who from the films, and all other have a handful of stories each, which rounds off our final timeline. Chapter 4. Everything Else. The first spin-off for Doctor Who was going to be the Daleks, and even though that did fail, the rate at which spin-offs have been pumped out means that there's plenty of stories without the Doctor in this universe. In total, there are 2,509 stories, with the biggest spin-off being Bernice Summerfield's run, who has more stories than more than 3/4 of the Doctors themselves. 996 of these stories were audio, 101 were comics, 193 were novels, and 210 of them were TV. However, the standout is short stories, which covered the remaining 1,002. In conclusion, there are a lot of Doctor Who stories in the universe, with the very minimum being 7,151. I'm sure that there are other stories that I've managed to miss out or that I haven't managed to find the spin-offs of, and I aim to keep my list updated and add whatever I need to it. The next question, I guess, is whether or not these stories are actually good and worth your time listening to, reading, or watching. Well, I'm eventually going to try and make a review of every single one. I am currently making my way through the classic series right now in my Pilgrimage series, which is linked in the above, and soon my video on the first run of EU content will be at the editing stage. These videos take quite a lot of time, and due to a lot of BBC copyright issues, are a little experimental at the moment, so if you liked anything about them in particular, let me know. I will also be releasing a document that you guys can follow along, which collates everything together, and I will highlight things that I think are Zoe approved canon, and that is pretty much what I like most about the stories. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.